Hello there! I will talk about the transport dynamics of pelagic sargassum in the Mexican Caribbean, sensitivity studies to the wind and depth of the transporting ocean layer. By pelagic sargassum, I am referring to two species of ground seaweed, Sargassum fluitans and Sargassum natans. These species are normally found en masse in the Sargasso Sea and in the northern Gulf of Mexico. However, since 2011, huge quantities were also observed in the Caribbean Sea and in the Central Atlantic. When sargassum reaches coastal zones, it accumulates in beaches and bays, where it dies, affecting the water quality, the local biota, and human activities such as tourism and fisheries. Several factors, including excess of nutrients and changes in the circulation of winds and currents, have been proposed to explain the massive proliferation of sargassum. However, most studies address the problem at the largest scale of the entire North Atlantic. The transport dynamics in the Mexican Caribbean have not yet been studied in detail, so we aim to fill this research gap. The ocean circulation in the Mexican Caribbean is dominated by the Yucatan Current, a northward flow parallel to the coast that eventually becomes the loop current in the Gulf of Mexico. In turn, the Yucatan Current is the continuation of the Cayman Current, an eastward flow perpendicular to the coast. The wind circulation is dominated by the easterly trade winds, which occur throughout the year. However, cold front events may cause northerly winds. Among the research questions to answer in this study, we have these three. How do stranding estimates change depending on different setups of a sargassum tracking model? The second question is, which model setup best reproduces the transport of sargassum in the Mexican Caribbean? And the third is, what is the fate of the pelagic sargassum observed throughout the Mexican Caribbean? First, we identified dates when massive arrivals of sargassum affected the Mexican Caribbean, and then we gathered oceanographic, atmospheric, and satellite data for those dates. Here I will present results of only two cases, September of 2018 and April of 2019. I developed a particle tracking model which uses the velocity fields of ocean currents and wind. We also performed sargassum detection with satellite images to compare and validate the modeling results. We used winds from two reanalyses, ERA 5 and CFS version 2. According to both reanalyses, the winds of September and April were mainly easterlies, but more variability was observed in April, with some northerly events of short duration. The difference between both wind reanalyses is that CFS produces stronger winds in the coastal region. The ocean currents were obtained from two different experiments of the HYCOM model, one with low resolution and the other with higher resolution. In September, the Yucatan Current was further from the coast than during April. The higher resolution HYCOM experiment produced a more intense current in the Cozumel Channel. Addressing the first question, how do stranding estimates change depending on different setups of a sargassum tracking model? A total of 32 different setups were tested, which resulted from the different combinations of considering ocean currents with low or high resolution, winds from the ERA 5 or CFS reanalysis, particle transport with the surface currents or with the average currents of the top 5 meters, and drag of particles by wind using different proportions of the wind speed, 0, 1, 2, and 3%. This diagram shows the 32 different setups achieved through the different combinations. For example, in the last setup, the particles were moved by wind drag using 3% of the wind magnitude, by the average currents of the first 5 meters, by the winds from the CFS reanalysis, and by the currents from the high-resolution HICOM. The virtual particles were initially located on each point of this regular mesh in the Mexican Caribbean. Using each day of the month as the initial time, particles were tracked 10 days forward using each of the setups. Stranding was measured as the percentage of the released particles that reached the coast. This box plot shows the results for September. Each box consists of 30 data because we used 30 initial days, and there are 32 boxes, one for each setup. In the y-axis, we have the percentage of the released particles that landed in the shore. Results show that there was more particle stranding when considering higher percentage of the wind speed, as shown by the black arrows. Also, there was more stranding when using the surface currents instead of the average currents of the top 5 meters, as shown by the orange arrows. And the CFS winds caused more particle stranding than the winds from the ERA 5 reanalysis, as shown by the gray arrows. In general, the same results were obtained for April. However, April had higher variability in the percentage of daily stranding. That's why we observe outliers and longer whiskers. This is a consequence of the greater variability in both the intensity and the direction of the winds during this month. In general, by increasing the magnitude of the wind by 1%, the percentage of the stranded particles increased by about 10%. This is expected because in this region the wind flows predominantly toward the coast. Using the surface currents resulted in 3% more stranding than using the average currents in the top 5 meters. This is because the surface currents were generally faster and more shoreward than the 5 meters currents. The usually stronger winds from the CFS reanalysis caused 2% more stranding than the winds from the ERA 5 reanalysis. And finally, there were no significant differences in particle stranding when using the low or high resolution HICOM model. To determine which setup best reproduced the transport of sargassum, we ran simulations back in time. The virtual particles were released in the Mexican Caribbean, where sargassum was detected by satellite, and the particles were backtracked for 7 days, using the 32 setups. For April, the setup that most closely matched the distribution of sargassum within this yellow quadrant was with the HICOM of low resolution, winds of the CFS reanalysis, using the surface currents, and 3% of the wind magnitude. For September, the best setup was that using the HICOM of high resolution, the average currents of the first 5 meters, and with no wind drag. Finally, we used the best setup of each month to investigate the fate of sargassum that depart from the Mexican Caribbean. Virtual particles were released in all the points of the uniform mesh. Each one of the 30 days of each month were used as initial times, and from each initial day, the particles were tracked forward for 10 days, so there were runs for each day of April and September. And we could calculate probabilities and averages. This animation shows the simulation that used the first day of April as the initial time. These are the results for April in the first row and for September in the second row. The first column shows how likely the particles were to run aground. We would say that the particles initially closer to the shore and further south were more likely to run aground, as indicated by the red color. The second column shows the time required for the particles to reach the coastline. For example, particles in the blue region required less than 4 days to run aground. The third column indicates the latitude at which the particles ran aground. For example, particles located in the red-orange region ran aground in the north of Quintana Roo. In summary, the particle tracking model was clearly more sensitive to the percentage of the wind magnitude used to drag the particles. Stronger winds caused more particle stranding. The surface currents caused more particle stranding than the deeper currents, and CFS winds caused more stranding than the Era 5 winds. Regarding the fate of Sargassum, Sargassum in the southwestern Mexican Caribbean was the most likely to strand in the shores, and Sargassum less than 50 kilometers from the coastline usually took less than 4 days to run aground. And that's it. Thanks for your attention.